I'm going to talk to you about Karl Marx in approximately 50 minutes. So I'm going to start with what you shouldn't expect from my talk. I'm not going to go into the technical details of Das Kapital, first part, second part, third part. I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is to show you how the method of critique that was developed by Karl Marx in Das Kapital has inspired my own work, and how it can be applied and is actually in need of being applied to our contemporary conjuncture, a political, economic, financial, social and environmental conjuncture. That is what I'm going to do. And I'm going to do that story in two parts. First part is going to zoom in a little bit on the method of critique that was developed by Karl Marx. And then I end in a more speculative note with the politics of critique, trying to apply the analysis of the French Revolution of 1879 to our contemporary political conjuncture. But I'm going to start off on a personal note, and that is that I was invited to give this talk about Karl Marx, and I've basically been thinking about what to tell you for the last 2 weeks, and that is because this guy is such a unbelievably intimidating guy. If you type in Karl Marx in Google, which is what we do today, you get 80 million hits. There has been so much written about this guy, and he himself has written so much. He was linked to particular types of disciplines by Brian just a minute ago, but actually this guy covers all these disciplines in one person. He is both a sociologist, a political economist, a critic of political economy. He does issues related to international development studies. He's an historian, an economic historian, a social historian. He is a political commentator, a pundit, and that all in one person. He was never acquainted or affiliated to a formal university post, so it doesn't make sense to link him one-to-one to a particular discipline. And the guy was also a very well-known, in his time, a very well-known journalist. Actually, he served as the European correspondent for the New York Daily, at that time the largest American-based newspaper in terms of circulation, writing on all sorts of topics related to the economy, to commodity booms and busts, to political developments, etc., etc. So, where to start? And initially I thought, well, hey, let's try to give some sort of an overview of the kind of thinking that the guy has done. But then I ultimately dropped that idea, and I zoomed in on the idea of basically using him as a framework to stipulate the extent to which Marx, his own work, has inspired my own approach to contemporary, globalized and financialized capitalism in all its different manifestations. And that means, ladies and gentlemen, one thing: that I'm not an expert on Marx. I read widely across all sorts of disciplines, and I basically, as a sort of magpie, I pick those particular types of insights which help me make sense of this unbelievably complicated situation that we're currently confronted with. As Brian already indicated, we've got a financial crisis which became visible in 2008, but of course had a long run-up up until from the late 70s, early 80s onward, if you want to believe Wolfgang Streeck. We're in the midst of a political crisis. The mainstream parties, the political establishment, established experts are increasingly being distrusted by the wider electorate. We're in the midst of some kind of a governance crisis where we don't know what kind of policies we need to pursue, and the only stuff that we pick out of our policy repertoire is increasing marketization, increasing commodification, even though we know that it doesn't work and that it has all sorts of negative consequences. We're in the midst of this huge and giant environmental crisis. We've got no clue how to solve it. And of course, vested interests have a lot of political power resources in order to block each and every attempt to do anything about this environmental crisis. We're in the midst of a social crisis, a cultural crisis, a lot of ennui and a lot of alienation among large large segments of our population. Look at the opioid addiction wave in the United States, etc., etc., etc. So there's a lot on our plate, and we are basically in need, first of all, with a set of critical tools which allow us to make sense of what is going on. And in order to be able to make sense of what is going on, we need simultaneously to criticize the current narratives that are being used by establishment parties and by the current elites in order to occlude, literally, what is going on. And there's no better resource to turn to than Karl Marx, because the guy had a set of tools, analytical tools, which are still very much applicable to our current conjuncture. That's what I'm going to show to you. And I do hope that at the end of my lecture, you will feel the urge to pick up some of his writings. Don't start with the first part of Das Kapital, but turn, for instance, to the Communist Manifest and read the thing. It's only 3,000 words, and it's a wonderful uprising piece of writing with all sorts of very famous sentences which give you an inkling of the kind of theoretical approach that Marx and Engels had developed in order to understand social transformations and the shift from one social constellation to another. Studying Marx has always been some sort of a generational issue. As Brian already indicated, if you look at the reception of Marx, there is a waxing and simultaneously a waning of the attention of scholars and pundits to the work done by Karl Marx. So, the personal note, I started out doing social and political philosophy in the late 80s, early 90s. And I was confronted with a staff which was basically from the baby boom generation, and they knew everything there was to know about the Miliband-Poulantzas debate, the Brenner debate, and all the other quite esoteric debates which were waged within the long stream of reception of Karl Marx. And of course, I had a guide. The guy was called Veit Bader. He was a professor of sociology and political philosophy here at the University of Amsterdam. Ultimately, he became my PhD supervisor. He was kicked out of Germany, just like Karl Marx, on the basis of a Berufsverbot due to his extreme left leanings. And he was a guy who showed me some of the key texts that I needed to write. So I started reading the original piece that was published in Past and Present by Brenner on the pre-industrial roots of capitalism. I started reading E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, and all these other Marxian attempts to reconstruct the rise of capitalism on the basis of English and British examples. Highly detailed kind of descriptions of what was going on. And ultimately, even though I did all that reading, I never became a Marxist. My sense and my sort of gut feeling is that we should take cues like a magpie from each and every thinker who can provide us with interesting analytical tools to again make sense of this highly complicated conjuncture with which we are confronted. And of course, I'm not suggesting that you need to become a Marxist in toto in order to be able to use the apparatus that Marx had developed to make sense of our own situation. You can choose and select parts of Marx in order to do that. And you can combine it with the wonderful work done, for instance, by people like Karl Polanyi or John Maynard Keynes or any other heterodox political economist who stresses that the market is itself a political institution, and hence there is a strong need in order to understand our economic developments to use and take into consideration and take seriously the unequal distribution of power resources, because that is the key hallmark of Marxian political economy, the key influence of the unequal division and distribution of political power resources. Okay, so what am I going to do? I'm going to tell the story about how Marx inspired my own work, which is basically about trying to understand financialization, as it has become visible during the great financial crisis, which became visible on 15th of September 2008, when the investment bank Lehman Brothers in mid-Manhattan went bankrupt. But of course there was a long build-up towards this great financial crisis, which also needs to be taken into consideration. So the way in which Marx inspired me was first of all by a particular type of method. So the largest part of my speech will be dedicated to spelling out what that method is and how that method can be applied to, again, our current conjuncture. And then I end with saying something about the politics of critique. The extent to which, and this is my own sort of speculation, the extent to which socio-economic disaffections are currently being translated and transformed into socio-cultural issues. And by doing that, I want to raise the question whether all these socio-cultural debates which dominate mainstream reporting do not actually refer to underlying socio-economic disaffections over the fact that capitalism, for the last 20 years, has worked wonderfully for the few, but hasn't worked for the many. Okay. The critical method developed by Marx, partially in Das Kapital, but also in other writings of his. It consists basically of three things. And that immediately explains why the first part of Das Kapital is so unbelievably hard to read. If you look at his own sort of autobiographical notes that he wrote while constructing Das Kapital, he's dealing with all sorts of compositional problems. And that is basically because he wants to do three things in one go. And we all know that doing three things in one go is a no-brainer, is a no-go. You shouldn't do that. If you want to write an 8,000-word academic paper, which is publishable in a mainstream journal, you should do only one thing. But Marx wanted to do three things. He wanted to write simultaneously a critique, a fundamental, well-reasoned, coherent, and consistent critique of reigning political economy. The guy was writing in the mid-19th century, so this was still a couple of decades before the marginal revolution which wiped out classical political economy in mainstream economics. Classical political economy, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, James Mill, and all the rest of them, they still relied on labor as the main source of value of anything that was exchanged in an economy. And then, with the marginal revolution, all the insights about labor and how it reproduces itself, how labor is used to reproduce capital, how this all takes place within factories, within particular types of legal entities where power actually is absolutely crucial in order to understand what is going on there, was suddenly put at the margin of the analysis, because what became center stage was simply demand and supply on markets. The most important institution in marginalist economics was the market. So this was still before Marx writing. Marx was still dealing with political economic insights. And he has indicated also in his autobiographical notes that he learned a tremendous amount of insights from reading the classical political economists like Ricardo, like Adam Smith, like James Mill, etc., etc. So he wanted to develop a critique of that particular form of political economy. And at the same time, he also wanted to criticize the current organization of the capitalist economy. So it's not only about economics, the theory about the thing which we call the economy. It was also simultaneously about the economy and how the economy was organized, the different types of legal categories that were used in order to legitimate particular types of hierarchical relationships within that economy. And thirdly, he wanted to talk about the sort of economic categories that we use on a day-to-day basis. And of course, these day-to-day categories are one way or the other related to academic economics, but they are lay categories. And as such, their political influence, their political power was much stronger than any sort of academic discourse. And this, of course, brings to mind a famous quote by John Maynard Keynes, who basically states that a politician, your average politician, is always under the influence of the forgotten writing of some scribbler in economics. And he's sort of reproducing the dogmas that have been repeated over and over again, uncritically, and are seen as sort of self-evident, self-explanatory categories. And of course, I can imagine that once I say this, you have all sorts of categories popping up in contemporary political discourse, which play the same kind of role in order to narrow down the kind of political options that we perceive to be available to us. So now in more detail, and I do that on the basis of a couple of pictures. So no text, couple of pictures, and then ultimately I'm going to say something about the kind of method that Marx reconstructively is seen to have been using. I start with some image which comes from mainstream economics. And again, the image that I'm using is not the sort of images that Karl Marx himself was confronted with when he was writing this critique of political economy. This is the sort of image that comes from neoclassical, marginalist economics that is still ruling the day. We call it orthodox economics, and we contrast it with heterodox economics. Keynes has become heterodox economics. Marx is very much heterodox economics. In the Netherlands, you hardly find any economist who still professes himself to be a Marxist political economy. Especially in the Netherlands, the faculties of economics serve as the madrasas of neoclassical economics. And the way in which neoclassical economics pictures the economy is absolutely telling. And I want you to take this very, very seriously, because pictures, of course, as we all know, tell a story which is much more influential than any writing by whatever economist will ever be. It is the pictures that predominate our thinking about what an economy is. So a picture, of course, always enlightens, elucidates particular parts of the economy, that large, complicated thing out there of which we all are part and parcel, but it also at the very same time occludes other parts of, again, that big thing, complicated out there, of which we are part and parcel. So how do neoclassical economics imagine the economy? Well, one way they look at it is like this. They simply see it as the place where a supply and a demand curve cross one another. This is where goods actually gets exchanged for prices. This is, of course, a market. It's a very idealized conception of what a market is. But what is quite telling about this image of the economy is what is left out of account. And I'm not going to list all the things that are left out of account, because I'm going to do that when I'm going to criticize the way in which the economy is being conceptualized by mainstream economics. But this is one way of looking at the economy. It's simply a market. And what is completely left out of account, which was still in classical political economy, is the firm. The actual place where physical labor power gets mixed up with commodities, gets mixed up with capital in a very complicated production scheme, ultimately resulting in the production of commodities, which are then, of course, being distributed over a particular spatial area where they get exchanged on actually existing markets. Neoclassical economics is only about the market. The distribution network, of course, plays a role of as implicitly assumed, because, of course, commodities need to be transported to the particular marketplaces. That is why in Amsterdam, for instance, we see all these white vans driving around, because people have ordered stuff on the internet, which is, of course, a marketplace. And then we get the distribution. And the payment is made through our digital payment system. This is one way of looking at the market. What is completely left out of account in this particular image of the economy is the firm, where physical labor is spent, mixed up with resources, and among them, of course, capital. Where through a very hierarchically power-based relationship, workers from 9 to 5 or from 9 to 6 are supposed to do the bidding of the capitalist, the owner of the firm. That particular part of the economy is completely left out of account. This is microeconomics. Macroeconomics looks something like this. We have a consumer's fund, we have a state somewhere, there are markets, there's business, etc., etc., and it simply circulates nicely. It's like a machine for the production and the distribution of wealth. And again, there's no conflict here. There's no politics here. This is simply what it is. It's like water circulating through a particular kind of mechanistic system. This is how the economy is being conceptualized by mainstream economics. And it is absolutely crucial that you take seriously these images, because these images are politically extremely powerful and they need to be criticized. And that is precisely what Marx set out to do. And then, of course, we've got the economy, a critique of capitalism. That's also what Marx aimed to do. And I, again, took inspiration from the way in which Marx did that in order to criticize a contemporary mode of capitalism. It's globalized. It was also globalized in Marx's time, by the way. If you read the Communist Manifest, you get these wonderful descriptions about how the bourgeoisie is increasingly claiming new territories in order to be able to transform capital into new capital, using cheap resources, using cheap labor, using cheap energy in order to generate surplus value. Wonderful passages in the Communist Manifest. What is left out of account in the conceptualization of the economy by mainstream economics is, again, class-related power differences. The slide behind me gives you the wage share of the privately produced value added, so basically what is produced on an annual basis in terms of value added in the private sector, and how it is distributed either between workers and or between capital. So what you see here is that in the late 70s, early 80s, approximately 80% of the wage share, 80% of the value added went to wages. 20% went to capital. And then, of course, something happened which resulted in the huge unequal distribution of power resources, which ultimately broke the backbone of labor unions across the globe due to the enhanced exit options of capital, which resulted in a gradual decline of the wage share of value added produced in the private sector. It was 80% in the late 70s, and it declined to below 65% in the early 21st century. In the Netherlands, same kind of story, although a little bit less extreme, but also in the Netherlands, a declining wage share across the board. And of course, this translates into another piece of data, which is that incomes, median incomes in the United States have been stagnating from this very same period onward. In the Netherlands, we're still at the level of median average household incomes, which is of the level of 1999. So here too, the declining wage share translates in stagnating median income or average income of households, also in the Netherlands. Core periphery, because the power differentials don't only play themselves out in developed economies. Since we're dealing with globalized capitalism, we're also confronted with core periphery dynamics. This is from a Norwegian think tank, together with a public think tank from the United States, which has tried to assess the amount of capital which has flown out of developed economies and compared that to the official development aid that has been sent to those developing countries. From the early 80s onward, almost 24 times as much capital has flowed out from developed economies as has been granted these countries in terms of development aid. So here too we see an extractionist machine at work. This is exploitation, ladies and gentlemen, on a global basis. And it works through cheap energy, cheap labor, cheap commodities, which are predominantly found in developing economies. And of course, tax evasion, transfer pricing means that multinational corporations don't pay any taxes whatsoever in developing economies and use the Netherlands, for instance, in order to ensure that it ends up in all sorts of tax havens like the Cayman Islands, the Virgin Islands, and all these other places which popped up in the Paradise Papers of 2 weeks ago. And of course, power, resources, and the unequal distribution of those power resources is visually and spatially to be seen in terms of the extensive lobbying activities that take place in places like Washington and also Brussels. This is an image of the European Center, the European institutions in Brussels, and all the blue dots are locations where formal lobbyists or registered lobbyists are present. And all those lobbyists are lobbying on behalf of multinational corporations, both European, Asian, and American-based multinationals. And this is simply to ensure that the economic regulations, or to put it otherwise, all the regulations that are one way or the other relevant to pursuing economic interests, serve the interests of multinational corporations. Another variable, if you wish, which is left out of account in mainstream economics. Final example, and this has, no, not the final example, I still have a couple to go. This is GDP development across a range of countries, as you see. And of course, it's a nice upward sloping curve. Wonderful. So we all get richer and richer and richer, which is very, very nice, of course. And this is simply measuring the economic activities in terms of conventional GDP metrics. Again, based on market transactions, which ultimately means that a lot of the stuff that we value, for instance, the household production of meals, the household production of comfort, cleaning the house and stuff like that, but also the volunteering kind of activities that we undertake in the voluntary sector is always left out of account. And the other thing, of course, that is striking for GDP is that it doesn't include anything which has to do with the depreciation of the value of natural resources, the decrease in biodiversity, the loss of soil quality, CO2 emissions, etc., is not included in GDP. It's all externalized. Future generations can clean it up if they are still able to live on Earth, but we don't care. So if you control for all those effects of conventionally measured GDP economic activities, you get a completely different kind of picture. Ecological economists have tried to do this. So of course all those data are proxies. They've done the best they could in order to come up with GDP figures which are corrected for the loss of biodiversity and all the other things that I mentioned. And if you do that in real progress indicator terms, you end up with countries which basically reached their max in the early 70s and from that moment onward have been stagnating or have even seen losses in terms of, again, the real progress indicator. That's another thing that has not been taken into account, is not taken into account into mainstream economics. And then finally, and this is of course where my topic pops up, financialization. One of the most striking insights, or anecdotes if you wish, which I came across during the great financial crisis, is that the highly complicated econometric models that the Central Planning Bureau in the Netherlands uses in order to make predictions about future economic growth, but also try to determine the effects of different kinds of policy measures, is that it didn't, and I'm going to emphasize this, it didn't include a financial sector. So there were no banks there. There were no stock markets, there were no bond markets, there were no derivative markets, there were no mortgage markets, there were no securitized mortgage markets in there. There was nothing in there which had anything to do with finance. And that's absolutely striking. So I don't know whether you recollect that, but Wouter Bos, the Social Democratic Minister of Finance, on the 3rd Tuesday of September 2008, something like between 8 and 15 days after the demise of Lehman Brothers, went to Parliament with a budget which was in surplus. It had the lowest state debt for decades, and it projected economic growth to the tune of 2.5%. And it's amazing. It was done by, these predictions were made by the Central Planning Bureau of the Netherlands. A huge, highly complicated econometric model of the Dutch economy. Basically a map of the Dutch economy. And it didn't include a housing market, or a mortgage market, or a securitized mortgage market, or anything that had to do with Dutch banking. And we all know what happened afterwards. Dutch taxpayers had to step in to the tune of 135 billion euros in order to make sure that banks didn't go bankrupt. GDP dropped to -4%. The budget surplus turned into a huge budget deficit almost overnight. And Dutch state debt jumped with 30% of GDP. It's amazing. And what we've seen over the last 3 to 4 decades is an enormous rise in terms of the balance sheets of financial institutions. And again, this particular rise and the kind of dangers and vulnerabilities it implies for macroeconomies, as well as for individual households and enterprises and other types of corporations, were not taken into consideration, not taken seriously, again, by mainstream economics. This is an image which I took from the Financial Stability Board, and they basically indicate that the overall global balance, the global size of banks' balance sheet is approximately 2 times global GDP. If you then look at other financial intermediaries, which is basically shadow banking, so entities doing banking kind of stuff without any banking regulation, it's 1 time global GDP. And if you then add up the other 3 figures or the other 3 lines, you ultimately see something like 4 times global GDP in terms of the balance sheets of financial intermediaries of whatever sort, pension funds, insurers, banks, and other financial intermediaries. 4 times global GDP, ladies and gentlemen. It is a huge growth in terms of the balance sheets of those entities over the last couple of years. Not taken seriously at all, not seen by mainstream economics. Another thing that wasn't seen was the enormous rise in especially private debt. We see here that household debt is approximately 33. It was 33% in 2007. 33 trillion, excuse me, basically 1/2 of global GDP in 2007, and it has increased again 7 years after the crisis, increased again to 40 trillion US dollar. It's a huge amount of debt which is carried by private households. And of course, we would have expected, since it was a debt crisis in 2008, that the world would have deleveraged, would have decreased its overall amount of debt. But we see the reverse. Basically, something like a 1 time global GDP, 57 trillion US dollars, has been added to our overall stock of debt over a period of seven years. Another thing that wasn't seen by mainstream economics is that banks, I already indicated that the balance sheet of banks is 2 times global GDP, that banks who present themselves to the outside world as crucial financial intermediaries between households with a deposit account, so they have savings, which they want to get a little bit of return on, so they put it on the bank, at the bank. So they open up a current account, a deposit on the balance sheet of a bank. And the banks then allocate those savings to small and medium-sized enterprises who want to make an investment, want to borrow in order to make an investment. And that story, again, is a bullshit story, because we see behind me that almost 1/3 to 70% of a bank's balance sheet simply consists of mortgages. Banks are only doing mortgages, and especially in the Netherlands, they only do mortgages. There was another thing that wasn't seen. So, criticizing the theories which are developed by academic economics in order to determine what it shows up and what it occludes is absolutely crucial in order to see what is really going on in our economy. So if we rely on mainstream economics to make sense of what is going on, our vision is going to be steered towards the market. And it doesn't show up the stuff which during the crisis have been proven to be so crucial. Which of course immediately suggests that we need different types of economic theories. We basically need Marxian kind of economic analysis in order to be able to, first of all, see the class-based power differences, in order to see the spatial power differences between core and periphery, in order to see that our contemporary economy relies strongly on cheap labor, cheap commodities, cheap energy, and cheap nature in general. And finally, we need to have this sort of critique in order to be able to see to what extent the mainstream lay categories which are being used by politicians are absolutely, completely, fully wrong. And I'm going to give you one example which I take from my own research. I'm interested in shadow banking because shadow banking played an absolutely crucial role in the great financial crisis. We had a bank run, also in the Netherlands, but it wasn't a bank run which was visible on the sidewalks. Depositors taking out their deposits from banks. We only had those images in the context of the bankruptcy of Northern Rock in the UK, but that was the only instance of a bank run where people actually wanted to take their money from the bank by standing in a queue on a sidewalk. There was a bank run with banks, but it took place on the back door of banks. Basically, large investors through the shadow banking engine, funding very cheaply banks on a day-to-day basis. And since they didn't trust the kind of assets or the valuation which has been put by banks on the assets on their balance sheet, they simply refused to do short-term lending any longer. And if you can't get any short-term lending as a bank, you become illiquid. And if you're illiquid long enough, you ultimately will become insolvable, which is what happened with banks like ABN AMRO, ING, and it didn't happen to Rabo, but it did happen to ING and ABN AMRO. So there was a bank run, but it worked its way through the shadow banking system. Shadow banking system is a very sort of complicated universe with all sorts of financial entities and different types of relations, different types of transactions. But one part of the shadow banking system is the repackaging of mortgages. Very simply, I don't know to what extent you're familiar with the repackaging of mortgages, residential mortgage-backed securities, that's their official name. You basically take out something like 10,000 mortgages, you sell those mortgages to a special purpose vehicle, basically a shell company. The shell company emits debt certificates which are being bought by institutional investors, pension funds, insurers. The money moves from the pension fund to the special purpose vehicle, from the special purpose vehicle to the bank, which means that the bank can do the lending all over again. This is what they have been doing in the Netherlands. Almost 1/3 of all mortgage contracts. Mortgage contracts in the Netherlands, by the way, have a grand total of a little bit over 100% of Dutch GDP, which makes the Netherlands the world champion in terms of mortgage debt. A piece of data that a lot of Dutch people don't know. And 1/3 of that was actually repackaged as I just described. And this all took place in the shadow banking system. 10 years after the crisis, lo and behold, we get a new initiative by the European Commission. And it's called the Capital Markets Union. The analysis behind this particular piece of legislation is that in the United States, they've got two complementary systems of capital allocation. They've got a banking system, which is 1x GDP of the United States, and they got markets. If you're a small and medium-sized enterprises, you can go to a market in order to get a loan or to get basically sell your debt certificates, your corporate bond, and you get a loan. So they got these two complementary financial systems for the allocation of capital. And that is why, according to the analysis of the European Commission, economic performance of the United States after the great financial crisis was so much better than in the Eurozone. So what do we need to do? We need to mimic the United States, and we also need, next to our banking system, we need a financial market system. Enters the Capital Markets Union, which in itself sounds plausible and a good idea if you're in favor of this particular type of mechanism. But the first thing that they do, and that is projected behind me, the Capital Markets Union is a plan of the European Commission to mobilize capital in Europe. It will channel it to all companies, including small and medium-sized enterprises. And this is, of course, the bullshit. Small and medium-sized enterprises. No one is against small and medium-sized enterprises. You may have strong feelings about multinational corporations, but small and medium-sized enterprises, wow, they're good. They're absolutely good. We need more of them. That's basically the political discourse. An infrastructure project. Well, it's wonderful to have infrastructural projects. And that need to expand and create jobs. We all want jobs. And by linking savings with growth, it will offer new opportunities to savers and investors. And then they've got this wonderful audio-visual, which is on the website. And the audio-visual is a story about Anna and, I forgot the name of the guy. Let's call him Dick. Anna and Dick. I don't know why I picked that name. Anna and Dick. And Anna is a successful entrepreneur who wants to break out. So she has a need for a loan. And then Dick, who is on the other side, and this is typical for the European Commission, they sort of set up all these borders. Borders are bad, of course. So there's these borders. Dick is 2 borders away from Anne. So and Dick has excess savings. So how do we get the excess savings of Dick in order to finance the breakout that Anna wants to undertake? And then, of course, in comes the Capital Markets Union, and it eradicates the borders, which are, of course, walls. So no walls any longer. And then Dick and Anne can shake hands. This is the storyline. But the first thing that they do, in terms of legislative initiatives, is setting up, and now you have to listen carefully, setting up a market for simple, transparent, and standardized securitizations. So what they actually do is facilitating, again, especially big banks, to sell off chunks of their mortgage portfolio on their balance sheet to pension funds and other institutional investors in order to, and this is absolutely staggering, in order to, again, finance real estate bubbles. The Eurozone suffered hugely from real estate bubbles. Ireland, the Netherlands, Spain, the UK, which is of course not part of the Eurozone, they all suffered from real estate bubbles. We've read all the warnings. You shouldn't facilitate real estate bubbles because if they burst, this has huge macroeconomic consequences for years. It makes you highly vulnerable. You shouldn't do that. And what are they doing? They're setting up again this market of securitizations. And these securitizations is basically legitimating, making legal, making possible again, or formalizing parts of the shadow banking markets which have responsible for the real estate bubbles before the crisis. So they sell it by financing small and medium-sized enterprises, whereas actually what they're doing is, again, facilitating real estate bubbles. And this is how lay economic categories provide political legitimacy for market-making projects which do not serve citizens, but serve vested economic interests. And it's done through, and you can think of similar kinds of terms. It's done by using the term of investing in small and medium-sized enterprises. It's done by basically framing CEOs or CFOs or other types of managers of large corporations as entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are good. They do stuff on their own risk. They provide new processes, new products, or whatever in new places and in new periods. But a CEO of a large multinational is simply a salaried manager. It has nothing to do with entrepreneurialism. So again, it's a terminology which has all sorts of good connotations, and it's used in order to occlude what these guys are really doing. Investors, similarly. Prince Bernard Jr. is presented in Dutch newspapers as an investor in real estate in Amsterdam. This is not investing, ladies and gentlemen. This is simply speculating on price rises of those pieces of real estate. Speculation has nothing to do with investing. So we're using a term which has all sorts of productive connotations in order to occlude the fact that this is simply skimming off value, using poor students in order to ratchet up the prices that they pay for very small rooms that they then can rent. Similarly, with regard to the University of Amsterdam, I have to do this. I'm awfully sorry. The Faculty of Social and Behavioral Sciences is confronted with cutbacks. It changes every week, so I got no clue how large the cutbacks are supposed to be. But it's all related to the knowledge economy. That's, again, a piece of bullshit which is used in order to occlude particular types of financial interests. The knowledge economy is, of course, a good thing. It sort of suggests that we're in this process of a transformation of our economy from physical labor to mental work, which sounds nice. It's not sweaty. It's nice and easy. You can do it in your own time, which basically means that there's no end to the work that you're supposed to be doing. But okay, it's a nice sort of transition. So it looks all nice, shiny and gleamy and whatever. But at the same time, what this has resulted in is that basically the University of Amsterdam has undertaken all sorts of real estate development project, which has resulted in an organization that is, to put it very briefly, that is over-leveraged. And the over-leveraged nature of the University of Amsterdam means that it doesn't have any wiggle space. When student numbers drop, you have no reserves whatsoever in order to absorb the loss of income that this is going to result in. So the knowledge economy actually has been translated into a particular type of real estate project, which of course serves the interests of project developers. It serves the interests of banks, because the University of Amsterdam has taken up huge amounts of loans in order to finance those real estate projects. They did that in the early 21st century when interest rates were in the somewhere like 4 to 5%. So they thought, well, hey, let's fixate our interest rates at the level of 4 to 5%. So they took out credit derivative swaps. And of course, they've subsequently not been confronted with declining interest rates, but with not with the increasing interest rate, but with declining interest rates, which basically means that due to these credit derivative swaps, the University of Amsterdam is leaking huge amounts of money to, in this particular case, Deutsche Bank, who is the one that provided the University of Amsterdam with those loans as well as those credit derivative swaps. So there are all sorts of interests involved in the particular way in which the whole discourse of the knowledge economy has been translated by the guys and girls who are making the decision on the basis of these particular types of discourses. So there is a strong need, again, to look into Karl Marx and his triple way of criticizing both academic economics, the economy, the thing which is supposed to be described and explained by academic economics, and the type of lay categories which are used by politicians and other players in order to legitimate the particular courses of actions that they have been following, which, if you take Marx seriously, is always traceable to particular types of class interests. Because if there's one thing that Marx very much stresses, then it is that you should follow the money. Qui bono. Okay, what does this mean? What does this mean for the particular approach by Marx? I took a quote, a long quote from the preface to a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. The guy has been working on this project for decades, and he has been doing it in different types of compositions due to the complexity of what he aimed to strive for. So if you look at his collected works, you find all sorts of prefaces, and then the next preface, and the next preface to a contribution to, or to a Grundrisse, or whatever. So all these different attempts to basically say the same thing, and that is that if you start looking at our economy in a very sort of simple case-based way. You take a particular kind of phenomenon or a particular type of observation, and once you start digging into that observation or in that case or in that entity, you will ultimately find, and this is a biological metaphor which I shouldn't use, but it's the easiest way to make this visible to you, you find the DNA of the particular way in which value is being formed given the particular state of capitalism. And I've been using the term globalized, financialized capitalism in order to flag particular characteristics of our contemporary mode of capitalism. But if you zoom in, if you take only one particular piece of commodity, let's say, I forgot my smartphone, but take a smartphone and you open up your smartphone, what you see is a global value chain. And that's not immediately visible if you take this particular object, because the object sort of suggests that it is unified, it's homogeneous, it's being produced by a single corporation. Let's say Apple, which is a particular entity. And the way in which that particular logo is being used is to occlude the fact that it is a global value chain. And the way in which the Apple iPhone is produced means that it brings together all these different parts of the world. And it's being done through different kinds of legal entities. The firm as such is basically a holding of intellectual property rights. It doesn't make anything. It's intellectual property rights and its capital. It has the largest amount of cash reserves of all corporations. It's being stacked in Ireland. It doesn't pay taxes over those cash reserves in the United States. It employs illegal child labor in their Foxconn factories, which are located in China, which are managed by a Taiwanese corporation. It's all over the place. And it's all meant to minimize costs, minimize regulatory burdens, minimize taxation, minimize cost of funding, and, of course, maximize profits. So take one thing, and it can be a piece of meat on your plate this evening. And once you start dissecting it, you see globalized, financialized capitalism. That's basically what is in this quote. In the social production of their life, men enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will. These are relations, the Apple relations that I just sketched out. They are relations, and they're absolutely real. And we perceive, if we start digging into this particular product, the Apple iPhone, we perceive those relations as completely unapproachable by individual human beings. We as consumer have only one role. We can buy them and we can use them, we can throw them away, but we can't change the way in which the global financialized economy is being set up. These relations of production correspond to a definite stage of development of their material forces of production. So the relationships always flag, mimic, suggest particular types of capitalism. Industrial capitalism is different from the type of capitalism that we're currently confronted with. And of course, there are national or even regional varieties of capitalism. But ultimately, we see below and behind those relations particular types of economic entities, particular types of interests, particular types of hierarchies, and particular types of distributions of political power resources. And the sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society. The real foundation on which rises a legal and political superstructure and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. A little anecdote. The Maagdenhuis was occupied April 2016, 2014, if I am correct. Is that correct? 2014? 2015. Wolfgang Streeck was in the Netherlands to present the Dutch translation of his book Gekaufte Zeit, Buying Time. Gekochte tijd is natuurlijk the title in Dutch. And he gave a very brief speech for the students which were occupying Maagdenhuis. And one of the things that he noted was that, hey, you all are raised in a neoliberal age, which means that your social consciousness, in Marxian terms, is strongly infused by a neoliberal discourse, which makes it very hard for you to come up with alternatives which do not conform to the market-making, entrepreneurial-based, investor-based subjectivity which comes out of neoliberalism. This is partially what Marx tries to express here. The way in which we think about ourselves, the relationships that we have with other people, the economy and the economic relations in which we are embedded, is very much informed by the particular economic hierarchies which are basically ruling our global world. Social consciousness. The mode of production of material life determines the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. It's not the consciousness of man that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. So there is a whole psychology linked to the political economic analysis that Marx provides his reader. The political economy talks about exploitation. The consciousness part, the psychology part of Marx, talks about alienation. We do not feel masters of our fate. We are embedded in structures which are seen to be inhuman, if you wish. And it is presented to us as simply the outcome of a process, globalization. I still vividly recollect my invitation to give a speech or do a debate on a Green Left Party Day, which was organized in the Dutch Parliament. And I had to debate with Bas Eickhout, Green Left member of European Parliament, about the future of Europe and what went wrong in the Euro crisis. And he was unavailable, he got stuck in the Thalys, so a senator of Green Left took over. And the first sentence that particular senator expressed was, globalization is simply a natural fact. Well, if you say that, then you immediately sort of occlude the fact that it is not a biological process, it's a political project. It's based on decisions which were historically made by particular identifiable people. And that doesn't make it any easier to overthrow, but it at least opens up the possibility for a different type of political project. I need to move a little bit more quickly. So what Marx actually does in terms of more contemporary social science, he is basically a depth realist. This is critical realism in action, what Marx does. And that's not coincidental, because the guys who are connected to critical realism, Roy Bhaskar, Andrew Sayre, Sayre being a quite prolific geographer, they of course were strongly, again, inspired by and influenced by Marxism. But it is about critical realism. So we have, of course, the domain of the empirical, that which we can see, which we can experience through our senses. And of course, what we can experience through our senses is never self-evident. It needs interpretation, it needs further analysis, it needs to be ripped apart. As I just did with that particular Apple iPhone. The iPhone needs to be ripped apart in order to make the global value chain, the hierarchical relationship behind it, the arbitrage between different jurisdictions, visible. And of course, ultimately, Cui bono, who is the one that benefits from this particular state of affairs. So it's not only about the domain of the empirical, we need to open up those observations, those cases, in order to demonstrate that behind it there are mechanisms. The observations are mostly based on particular events. The iPhone is renewed, or the iPhone is presented, which is the event. We can observe it, and then we need to see to what extent that event is caused by underlying mechanisms. So causality basically looks like this. It's an event which we see, which we perceive, and then we have to ask the question, it's retroduction, we have to ask the question what the nature of social reality must be in order to present itself to us in the way in which we have experienced it, in the way we've actually seen it. And that is the type of analysis that Marx pursues basically through all his writings. He is trying to basically do away with the service perceptions of our reality in order to demonstrate that underneath it we have particular types of structural patterns. Capitalism is a structure, and it produces particular patterned outcomes. The rise in inequality that Piketty has demonstrated, the book from 2014, is not a coincidence, it's not contingent. No, it's the structured outcome of the way in which we have organized capitalism. That is the sort of question that Marxists are posing. And that is the sort of analysis that you, I hope, would like to undertake. And of course, this results in a completely different image of what the economy is. So if we go back to the image of the economy which was presented by mainstream economics, a demand and supply curve. This is basically it. No producers, no consumers, only a sort of a very abstract consumer, an abstract producer, which is assumed because someone has to bring the goods to the market and someone has to buy the goods. But they're sort of on at the margin of the figure. And then Marx. Marx gives you a much more complicated image of the microeconomy. This is how capital moves through a particular firm and the different kinds of outlays that the firm has to do in order to be able to generate surplus value. It results in a macro picture which looks a little bit like this. We have use value, and then it gets into all sorts of markets. It produces exchange value of commodities that results in money, and money then becomes capital, which is invested again, and then the cycle starts over and over again. A completely different image of the economy. And Marx provides you with, on top of that, which should be superimposed on what I just showed, a class structure. A class structure which, of course, consists of different types of classes. The bourgeoisie, the self-employed, the petty bourgeoisie, the semi-autonomous wage earners, the self-employed, as we would say, the proletariat, which, of course, falls apart in different sorts of categories, the managerial caste, and then the owners of capital, the guys and girls who own the shares. So it ultimately results in a class structure. And on top of that, Marx also provides you with a theory of socio-economic change. And it's all in that one book, Das Kapital, first part. So this is a completely different image of the economy, which is used in order to criticize the simplified images that are being constructed by neoclassical economics. We need that in order to make visible what is occluded by academic mainstream economics. We need that in order to be able to criticize the legitimations which are being provided by lay economic categories, which are used by politicians, etc., etc. Okay, I hope you get that, sort of. Then the second part, and I'm going to be much briefer on the second part. We've just gone through a huge electoral cycle on both sides of the Atlantic. The United States, United Kingdom, and of course large parts of the European Union. The outcomes are sort of mixed. In some parts, mainstream parties have been able to keep their crucial centrist positions. In other parts of Europe, they have lost. They have lost predominantly to right-wing populist parties, not to left-wing populist parties. The other sort of striking observations of the electoral cycle has been the wiping out of social democracy in large parts of Europe. And of course, this has generated a huge amount of analysis, both on the side of academic political scientists and a lot of pundits and commentators in newspapers. And the sort of obvious observation is that, strikingly, 10 years after the crisis, which again has blown huge holes in all sorts of balance sheets, the balance sheets of states, the balance sheets of banks, but also the balance sheets of households, there's still 30 to 35% of Dutch households who are confronted with debt, nominal debt, which is higher than the value of their real estate, the collateral. As I indicated, average household real income is still at the level of 1999. In Italy, it's at the level of 1997. In the US, it's at the level of the early 80s, late 70s. So households have not benefited equally from the sort of economic recovery. There's still a bill of almost 30 billion open for the savings of the banks in 2008 in the Netherlands. the great financial crisis in total has cost more than all the expenditure which was used in order to win the Second World War from the Nazis and Japan. So it's a huge discrediting of elites, of the financial services sector, of politics. And still, if you look through your eyelashes at what's happening in Europe politically, what is sort of dominating the analysis as well as news reports is that it's all about refugees, it's about minorities, it's about the Islam, it's about IS, it's about terrorism. So to put it very sort of briefly, it's not about socio-economic issues, it's not about banks who have ensured that people had to pay up for their stupidity. No, it's all about cultural kind of topics. And even though that is, of course, the headline, I still want to venture the claim that underneath it is disaffection, which is predominantly based on all sorts of socio-economic and increasingly environmental kind of variables. If you look at the survey data, what people also express to an increasing extent is that they worry about the ability of their children and grandchildren to live life in the same way as they have been doing. So the accessibility of labor markets, housing markets, higher education, for a lot of people in their 20s, 30s, has diminished pretty rapidly. So there have been some calculations about which particular generation actually is going to bear the burden of the great financial crisis. And it's not my generation, nor is it the generation above me. It's not the baby boomers. It's not the people in their 40s or 50s. It's the people in their 20s and 30s. And of course, since we have linkages between generations, it's pretty obvious that the expectation that children and grandchildren will not be able to live the same kind of life as generations currently living have been living feeds, of course, in this sense of insecurity, precarity, uncertainty, which, in my view, has informed the backlash against mainstream parties. And the reason why it ultimately ended up not on the left-wing side, but on the right-wing side is that, and this is sort of encapsulated in the quote behind me, is that we have this sort of propaganda machine, which is called the media. We have a propaganda machine which makes every disaffection inflect in socio-cultural terms. I'm a member of the editorial board of Buitenhof. I shouldn't say this, this is going to be filmed. So ultimately they will be able to hear this, that I'm saying this. I'm a member of the editorial board of Buitenhof, and one of the striking observations is that there's hardly any journalist on that editorial board, and it's one of the highest ranking journalistic programs on Dutch television. So you would have expected that these are of course also high quality, high market, upmarket journalists. There's almost no one on the editorial board which has any working knowledge of economics, the economy, finance, banks. They don't have this sort of memory of what happened during the last 10 years, let alone a memory of what happened from, let's say, the late 70s onward. And the kind of trajectory that's being described by Wolfgang Streeck in Gekochte Tijd, buying time, or Gekaufte Zeit. So there is a complete lack of knowledge about stuff which has to do with socio-economic issues. And there is, at the same time, a huge amount of knowledge in that very editorial board, both in terms of simply the substantial knowledge that they have of cultural issues, identity-based issues, and in terms of the network of people whom they may invite to present at the table of Buitenhof the different standpoints related to these cultural identity-based issues. Across the board, they have extensive knowledge and an extensive network in that particular field. So one of the striking things, if you look at Dutch media over the last 30 years, is a complete forgetting of socio-economic, financial, political economic issues, and a complete dominance in the editorial boards in terms of the CVs of reporters of cultural identity-based issues. So the disaffection, which has real economic, socio-economic, and increasingly environmental roots, is inflected through and is articulated through socio-cultural identity-based issues. That is my claim. And I take heart from the quote by Karl Marx behind me, which is from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which he wrote not in 1879, as I indicated, but after the revolutionary period of 1848. And it starts with the famous quote, whom you all may know: men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. And just as they seem to be occupied with revolutionizing themselves and things, creating something that didn't exist before, precisely in such periods, in such epochs of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service, borrowing from them names, battle slogans, and costumes in order to present this new scene in world history in time-honored disguise and borrowed language. And then Marx gives a couple of examples. But if you take this quote and let it sink in, it's pretty obvious. And you look at parliamentary debate in the Netherlands right now, and it's pretty obvious that, again, the revolution, which could be there, because there is a lot of disaffection with regard to mainstream parties, experts, etc., gets inflected in a way which is highly nostalgic. Forum voor Democratie, the PVV, right-wing parties who use a sort of glorified Netherlands which never existed, using all sorts of nationalist symbols in order to do a form of renewal, which is of course some kind of a parody of something that never existed. And this, of course, raises all sorts of questions which are increasingly being answered in terms of we need a new narrative. We absolutely need a new narrative in between the narrative of further neoliberalization, which is, of course, the kind of narrative which is no longer expressed loudly and clearly by our current political elites, but it is whispered. We need to do new trade treaties, but we're going to do it without an arbitrage court. So we're going to set up a public arbitrage court, which basically does the same, but it is meant in order to deflect some of the criticisms that have been voiced by NGOs and other progressive parties in parliament. But it's still the same spirit of neoliberalization, the same spirit of globalization, the same extending of corporate interests that is behind this particular program. The dividend tax, which is going to be repealed in the Netherlands, the decrease in terms of corporate taxation of 3%, which adds a further impetus to the race to the bottom, which is ongoing, which basically means that capital is no longer forced to pay for their usage of public material infrastructure, and we have to pick up the bill. And, of course, this sort of neo-nationalist response, which dwells in nostalgia, and where, for heaven's sake, is a progressive answer to this particular predicament. I raised the question. I'm not going to answer this, but if you want any sort of set of analytical tool which could help you formulate such an answer, go to Karl Marx. Thank you very much.